Alright, the Game Changer system has been out for a little while now, and I think it's been quite successful. But, look, there are some cards that should be game changers that currently aren't. So, here's one for each color, plus colorless and a land. Trouble in Pairs is a 4-mana white enchantment. It makes it so that whenever an opponent attacks us with 2 or more creatures, draws their second card each turn, or casts their second spell each turn, we draw a card. It also has some flavor text about extra turns or something. Trouble in Pairs is one of the strongest card draw engines in all of Commander. It triggers off of nearly any action a player might take and can trigger multiple times a turn. From my experience, at lower power level tables, Trouble in Pairs outperforms Rhystic Study, mainly because it can't properly be played around. It triggers off too many things. Even if you try your hardest to only play one card each turn and never attack the Trouble in Pairs player with 2 or more creatures, eventually you're going to have to draw a second card. That's unavoidable because most decks have dedicated a good portion of their list to card advantage, and treating all of those as unplayable might as well be the same as conceding on the spot. Against Rhystic Study, I can pay the 1. Against Trouble in Pairs, I can only stop playing. At the highest power level, Rhystic Study performs better because there are often way more than 2 spells played each turn, and the forced efficiency of the meta makes paying the 1 unrealistic. But I don't care about that, and neither should the Game Changer list. Once we start talking about CEDH or CEDH adjacent decks, whether or not a card is a Game Changer becomes irrelevant. Game Changers are a system meant for lower power level decks, and I'm a big Bracket 2 enjoyer. I love playing Magic in the dirt. Gameplay in these lower brackets is incremental and should require a non-trivial amount of build-up before the payoffs start going crazy. But Trouble in Pairs doesn't require any build-up to draw 3 to 9 cards per turn rotation. And that's ultimately the problem with the card. It's too easy. I think the people choosing cards for the list are aware of how strong Trouble in Pairs is, which is why the card was part of the first iteration of the Game Changers list. But then it was removed, and honestly that boggles my mind. The reasoning given was, while it can draw a lot of cards, it's on par with some cards that are not on the list. This is a statement that has me completely lost as to which cards they are referring to. I can't think of a single other card not on the Game Changer list that can draw as many cards as easily as Trouble in Pairs. But, according to the people in charge, there are multiple. Getting stuck on specifics isn't always helpful, but I think in this particular case, it would have been really good to actually list some examples. Like, do they consider the Great Henge to be on the same level? Necrodominance? Skull Clamp? While these are very powerful cards, they all have bigger restrictions and requirements that make them inherently more suited to a casual environment. The problem isn't just that Trouble in Pairs is extremely powerful, but rather that it's extremely powerful without needing any setup. Trouble in Pairs should go back on the Game Changer list. Its initial inclusion was very reasonable, and its removal a frankly bizarre choice. Next, we have Mana Drain. Mana Drain is a 2-mana blue instant that counters a spell, and then, at the beginning of our next main phase, we add colorless mana equal to that spell's mana cost. Mana Drain is a strictly better counterspell. It was released during an era where mana burn still existed, and the colorless mana it added could, in some situations, be considered a downside. I say in some situations because from what I have heard, the card was still overpowered, even back then. Mana Drain ties a major ritual to an unconditional counterspell without any increase to its own cost. It's obviously a busted card. However, my main argument for why it should be game-changed is actually somewhat removed from that. Yeah, its power level is definitely a factor, but my main issue with the card are the toxic play patterns it encourages. Removal takes on a strange role in Social Commander. It's undeniably necessary, otherwise Magic doesn't really function as a game. But we also don't want to overdo it, because then Commander stops being fun. Spamming removal is absolutely an effective path to victory. It's just a lonely one. Commander is a social game, and social games require cooperation. All players enjoying the game together should be the priority, even if that requires us to voluntarily power down our decks. It's always important to remember that the very moment we agree to not play CEDH, we are already opting into the performance that we call Commander, and we take on a certain responsibility to be mindful of the other cooperators. And one of the many ways we approach that mindfulness is through limiting our removal. Then, since we have limited our selection, we automatically become required to be more picky in our execution. Instead of blasting our interaction at the first viable target, we wait for important moments. But mana drain twists that dynamic. When we have a mana drain in hand, it's easy to become focused on the resources it can provide rather than the damage it will do. We'll hold the spell in hand, waiting for a high mana target to show up. And once it does, we'll counter it regardless of if it's coming from a player that's already been behind or has been struggling all game. Sometimes we'll pass priority through the small spells, hoping for something more worthwhile, only to move through two players' turns and then feel the anxiety of a missed opportunity, as we've already planned out our next turn with the additional mana in mind. The third player then attempts to cast anything, and that becomes our target by default, as we need the mana. I've encountered scenarios similar to these many times, and in those moments, mana drain isn't treated with the reverence that removal in Commander deserves. It encourages us to forget about the other players at the table, to selfishly focus on only what can be gained, not on what is lost. For its absurd power and unhealthy gameplay patterns, I think mana drain should be moved onto the Game Changers list. Moving on to black, I request that you give me a chance to make my argument. I'm going to suggest a card that many of you will disagree with, and I think that's fine. This is definitely a controversial choice, but I firmly believe that this card deserves consideration. Grey Merchant of Asphodel is a 5-mana 2/4 zombie. When Grey Merchant of Asphodel enters the battlefield, each of our opponents loses life equal to our devotion to black, and then we gain as much life as every opponent combined lost. Gary is a constant of black. He's both a big finisher and a great way to stabilize during the mid-game. He also requires us to have a reasonable board to properly utilize his ETB, as he's not independently powerful like Trouble in Pairs or Mana Drain. But Gary was not designed with Commander in mind. With only a small board, he will drain our opponents for a hefty amount of life, and then restore our life total hugely. This last part is my worry regarding Gary. I don't mind that he's a finisher. I don't mind that he can quickly kill a table. So can any green overrun, this isn't an issue. The problem is the life swing that comes along with it. Even with a relatively tepid board state, it's not unusual to see Gary heal his controller for 20 or 30 life, and that becomes problematic when put into the context of the casual incremental gaming that occurs in Bracket 2. To combat such a burst, other bursts of power are needed, and that would be fine if black wasn't the color of reanimation. Once a player sets up even a minor Gary loop, dealing with them becomes incredibly difficult. In Bracket 2, I do really want to stress the point here that all of my issues with Gary are specifically about Bracket 2 gameplay. Outside of that space, I think he's totally fine. But in Bracket 2, games involving Gary often become entirely shaped by him, and while removing him permanently is absolutely possible, he changes the game until that happens. Gary is also a good candidate for the Game Changer list because putting him on there wouldn't have a big impact on Bracket 3. He's best in mono black, and many of the black Game Changers are very specific and quite skippable for most decks. Like you don't want to play Ad Nauseam or Braid's Cabal Minion in the vast majority of decks anyways. And depending on your play environment or personal preference, the tutors and opposition agent can also be undesirable. This means that Gary would only get pushed out of Bracket 2, while still being easily accessible in a Bracket 3 environment. And I think that's the best possible use case for Game Changers. Also, Ad Nos doesn't need to be on the list just because it's good in CEDH, who cares about that? The Game Changer list is a tool to shape the experience of the lower brackets, not a tier list of the strongest cards. If you want to blast Ad Nos in your Battlecruiser deck and die because you flipped an 8-mana creature, then I don't see how that's an issue. Okay, sorry, that's a bit besides the point. In my ideal world, I wouldn't want to just game changer Gary, but rather have Wizard's printer replacement first with mostly the same effect, except that it restores life equal to your devotion, not equal to the damage dealt. That way the aggressive potential of the card would still exist in the lower brackets, but it's less domineering. But given the current reality, Grey Merchant of Asphodel should be moved onto the game changer list, because he's too impactful for how easily he's recurred to be a healthy card in a bracket 2 environment. Although I can definitely see if you like Gary, look, I get it. If you've enjoyed the video though, then please don't forget to give it a thumbs up and check out my Patreon where you can support me directly. I also offer services over there like deck reviews. If that's something you're interested in, link down in the description. Thank you very much. Okay, so Gary was probably a controversial choice, but I think we can hopefully all agree on my selection for red. There are actually two cards that compete for the spot, being Reiterate and Mana Geyser. Reiterate has never been used for anything honest in its life, but Mana Geyser is still definitely the most egregious of the two. Mana Geyser is a 5-mana sorcery that adds 1 red mana for each tapped land our opponents control. Skillful commander is often decided by mana, as card draw is a given, and Mana Geyser is limitless mana for a turn. My expectation when casting this spell is that it'll generate at least 15 mana, often much more than that. I've cast Mana Geyser for as much as 30 mana. Given Red's nature, its access to spell duplication and spellslinger synergies, Mana Geyser is a card that often wins games on the spot. The main issue here is the same as with the other cards before it, and the one that forms the through line of this video. Mana Geyser isn't incremental and can't really be used in an incremental fashion. While an argument could be made that, since Mana Geyser is a 5-mana spell, it can be interacted with through a counterspell, silence, or by just having enough pressure on the board to prevent its casting in the first place. But Bracket 2 shouldn't be a place where players need to worry about an individual card ending the game as easily as Mana Geyser can. And in a funny twist of fate, kind of opposite to Mana Drain, Mana Geyser encourages good behavior because it inherently encourages its caster to avoid counterspells and interaction, as it's best cast when everybody else is tapped out. Since free spells aren't a major part of the lower brackets, a tapped out board of opponents usually just means free reign, and in those moments Mana Geyser just does too much for the environment it's in, and hence should be added to the game changer list. Closing out the colors, we have green's Greatest Sin, Greater Good. Greater Good is a 4-mana enchantment with an activated ability that lets us sacrifice a creature and then draw cards equal to the sacrificed creature's power before discarding 3 cards. We can activate this ability any number of times. So long as we have creatures, we can sacrifice them. Green is incredibly powerful in casual commander. The color's natural strengths, big mana and creatures, play well into a social environment that intentionally limits its removal. Where other colors struggle for mana, green has an abundance. Where they carefully construct win conditions, green slams big beaters. And that's fine, because green can be dealt with. It can be run out of resources. It struggles when behind, when needing to compete with a board state that can deal with its threats as they appear. This is the natural balance of the colors. But Greater Good throws everything for a loop. Instead of being vulnerable to removal, green can now fizzle anything thrown at it, and quickly turns creatures into resources, into creatures, into resources, into creatures. Greater Good is too powerful at circumventing the tools that exist to deal with green's major strengths, which pushes a color already abundant with options into an oppressive state. If this card were to see frequent play in the lower brackets, it would force stronger and stronger responses, pushing the game towards wider ranging and more exhaustive removal options that diminish the social experience. Much like Trouble in Pairs, Greater Good simply provides too many resources for too little cost, and should be put on the Game Changers list. I didn't spend as much time discussing these last 2 cards because I felt like their inclusion on the list was fairly obvious. Ironically, that is also true for the next card, but I could still talk about it for days. The colorless card that should be moved onto the Game Changers list is, of course and obviously, Soul Ring. Soul Ring is the strongest card in the format, the most powerful spell available, a piece of ramp so absurd that the only other format it's permitted in is Vintage, and even there it's limited. Wizards themselves acknowledged that Sol Ring should be a game changer and then opted out of it because of a sense of nostalgia and an appeal to emotion. Based on power level and game impact, the standard that all other cards are judged by, Sol Ring should be a game changer. Any argument against Sol Ring being put on the list requires a non-gameplay focused justification, and the most common amongst those is the only one I want to address right now. Sol Ring is found in every precon, hence it can't be made a game changer because then precons wouldn't be allowed in bracket 2 anymore. This is a bunch of horse shit. Even if Sol Ring were to be made a game changer, no reasonable person would get upset at somebody for playing an unmodified precon with it still in there. And if they draw it, you can always just cycle it. There are other precons with game changers in them as well. And once a player starts modifying their list, replacing Sol Ring is trivially easy. Just add another land, the vast majority of precons could use it anyways. Going forward, all Wizards would have to do is stop printing Sol Ring in precons, vastly improving the bracket 2 experience. I understand that it would take a while before that decision would actually reach the printers, but I don't see that as an argument to not take that step. Replace the card with a Command Lotus or whatever. Same card, but it's a ritual or got some charge counters or something. Something that balances it and makes it appropriate. Literally anything that isn't the strongest card in the format that completely warps any game it appears in. Okay, with that out of the way, I'm going to give you a different colorless card as well, because I think we can all agree that the Sol Ring ramble is just a bit tedious at this point. Like, I get it, Baumi. You don't like Sol Ring. Yeah, it's true, I don't like Sol Ring. It's mostly just because it ruins games, but anyways, let's move on. Meekstone is a 1-mana artifact that makes it so creatures with power 3 or greater don't untap during their controller's untap step. Meekstone is a dumb stacks piece that makes most creature decks completely unplayable until it's removed. It fully shapes the game around itself, preventing the exact kind of gameplay that's encouraged in the lower brackets. There's not much else to be said here. Meekstone just sucks ass to play against and should be put onto the game changer list because of that. Oh, and in case you're wondering, Winter Orb may not be a game changer, but because it's MLD, it's banned out of brackets 2 and 3 anyways, which is why it doesn't need to be listed. Finally then, a land. Nykthos Shrine to Nyx is a legendary land that either taps for colorless mana, or for 2 mana, it taps to add mana of any color equal to our devotion to that color. Nykthos is another card that I think is primarily problematic, specifically in bracket 2. Monocolor decks have quite the easy time getting tons of value out of Nykthos, often generating 5, 6, 7 mana as early as turns 4 or 5. And that's just a bit much for an environment in which precons are supposed to be able to play. While Nykthos doesn't generate quite the same burst of mana as Mana Geyser can, its repeatability makes it just as impactful when viewed across a couple of turns, especially when considering that it doesn't have a downside to help rein in that power. Nykthos enters untapped, can still generate mana even without any devotion on the board, and its main balancing mechanism, it being legendary, is irrelevant in Commander. I also think it's noteworthy that Nykthos is a very expensive card, and that should be part of the consideration. No card should be banned or game changer just for being expensive, but if a card is already on the brink, and then it's also expensive, then I think it's a reasonable factor to consider. Lower brackets are usually much more budget friendly, and getting dominated by a card like Nykthos or Mana Drain or Trouble in Pairs is likely to lead to a negative experience for new players. For being essentially fast mana, Nykthos Shrine to Nyx should be added to the Game Changer list. The Game Changer list is currently in an odd place. Based on its systematic function, it's a tool to manage the play experience of the lower brackets. But there are cards on the list that are clearly just CEDH problem children, like Thassa's Oracle, Opposition Agent, Gamble, and Lion's Eye Diamond, that would absolutely be fine in a casual environment. I know some of you might argue about Oppo Agent, but Oppo Agent is fine. A friend of mine plays Thassa's Oracle in his Merfolk deck, and it's honestly one of the worst cards in the list. If he ever manages to win the game with it, then it's because the game's been going for 3 hours and he somehow got to Devotion 30. But other than that, it's just a creature with a big scry. And when you aren't using it to tutor out combo pieces, Gamble is genuinely just a funny card. Alongside these, there are also a couple of odd cards that are just fine. Like Jin Gitaxia's Core Ogre is a 10 mana creature that gives us an entire turn to deal with it before it does its mean thing. And Sway of the Stars mostly just does nothing. The cards that pose real issues in lower brackets aren't so much the big finishers or powerful combo pieces, but rather the options that give fast starts, out of nowhere explosive turns, or the sweepers that efficiently reset the board. Looking at you, Fairbell. I am an unashamed bracket 2 gamer. Those are by far the matches I enjoy the most. And I feel like currently, the Game Changer list isn't paying enough attention to that space. The space that should actually be defining the cards on it. So these are my suggestions. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did enjoy it, don't forget to give it a thumbs up, we'll definitely appreciate that. Sorry, it's a bit longer today. I just kind of started writing and then I was at 3,500 words. Sorry, Toski. Poor Toski has to edit this. Anyways, it was my birthday last week. I got a present from my friends. I got some great friends. I just wanted to show it off because I really like it. Look at it! Oh, isn't it gorgeous? It's the pixel art command tower in foil. This thing is way too expensive. I've kind of had it on my wish list for a long time, but I never ended up buying it because it's just a very expensive card. So they all pitched in and got me this thing. I'm very excited about it. This is such a beautiful card. Anyways, just wanted to show that off. Go check out my Patreon, link down in the description. Yell at me about Gary being fine. And I'll see you guys on Sunday. I'll see you guys on Sunday. Goodbye.